The story begins in the small American town of Springville, Ohio. We meet Sarah Brooks, a 35-year-old woman who has always been an exemplary wife and mother. Her husband, John Brooks, 38, is a successful entrepreneur who is raising two children with Sarah. Their life, at first glance, is perfect. They live in a cozy house in the suburbs, where prosperity and stability reign. However, behind the external facade of happiness lies an emotional emptiness that Sarah feels more and more every day. John is immersed in his work. His business is growing and he spends a lot of time traveling and on business trips. This makes Sarah feel lonely. She spends her days taking care of the house, the children, and occasionally participating in local events such as charity fairs and parent-teacher conferences at school. However, as the years go by, she begins to feel that something is missing in her life, especially the warmth and attention she once received from her husband. Into this background appears Mark Stevens, a close friend of the family. Mark, 40, is an attractive, charismatic man who works as a lawyer. He has known the Brooks family for a long time and is a frequent guest at their home. Everyone in the town knows him as a successful, responsive person, always ready to help others. He has been John's friend since his youth, and they have developed a strong relationship. However, with each visit from Mark, Sarah begins to notice that there is more to him than just her husband's friend. Mark comes to family dinners, participates in family activities, and always shows attention to Sarah. She begins to feel that he understands her better than John. Mark is often left alone with her when John is late at work. These moments seem random at first, but as they spend more time together, an emotional connection begins to develop between them. Sarah finds herself impatiently waiting for him to come home. Sarah feels a growing attraction to Mark. She begins to care more about her appearance when she knows he will come. She catches his admiring glances and feels his attention to her become more personal. These seemingly innocent gestures and conversations soon turn into a hidden game. Sarah no longer simply waits for Mark as a family friend. She begins to look for opportunities to be alone with him. One day, when John is away on a long business trip, Mark shows up unexpectedly at their home with a gift for the kids. He brings games to spend time with them, but Sarah knows it's just an excuse to see her. When the kids go to their rooms, there's a tense silence between Sarah and Mark. He looks at her with a special glint in his eye, and she knows their friendship has grown into something more. "Have you been alone for long?" Mark asks, not taking his eyes off Sarah. "Yes, John left yesterday. He will be on a business trip for a whole week," she answers, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Mark comes closer. Their conversations become more and more frank, and Sarah feels her inner barriers begin to crumble. She sees Mark not just as a family friend, but as a man who can give her what she so lacks: attention, care, and most importantly, understanding. The night ends innocently, but Sarah leaves feeling like she's crossed a line. Her thoughts are now completely consumed by Mark. She begins to compare him to John, realizing that she hasn't had the passion and emotional intimacy with her husband that she found in Mark for a long time. Internal conflict. Sarah's inner world changes. On the one hand, she loves John and values him as a husband and father to her children. On the other hand, Mark fills the void she felt in the last years of her marriage. Sarah begins to wonder if it is possible to combine two lives, a loving wife and a secret lover. She tries not to show her feelings in front of John, but her thoughts constantly return to Mark. Every time John returns from work, Sarah finds herself feeling guilty for waiting for Mark instead of him. A struggle between duty and passion, loyalty and attraction begins in her soul. In this part, we see the beginning of a break that will soon lead to tragic consequences. After their first meeting without John, Sarah Brooks realizes that her feelings for Mark Stevens go beyond friendship. She tries to suppress this attraction, but every day it becomes more difficult for her to control her emotions. The internal conflict grows. Her mind tells her to be faithful to her husband, but her heart reaches out to Mark. Sarah finds herself trapped between her duties as a wife and the passion that now fills all her thoughts. From that moment on, meetings with Mark take on new meaning. Every visit to the Brooks home becomes something special for them. When Mark appears on the threshold, they exchange a look that says more than any words. Their communication remains on the edge of what is acceptable, but both are aware that this line is about to be crossed. One day, John invites Mark to dinner. It was a normal family evening, but for Sarah it turned into a real test of endurance. Mark, sitting opposite, jokes with John, talks about business, but at the same time stealthily glances at Sarah. His gaze fills her with anticipation. His every gesture and word fuels her desire. At some point, Sarah, unable to bear it, goes to the kitchen to pull herself together. She understands that she is on a dangerous path, but she can no longer stop. After dinner, when John goes to put the kids to bed, Mark approaches Sarah in the kitchen. He stands too close, his breath on her neck. "Sarah, you know there's more to us than friendship," he whispers, looking into her eyes. Sarah is silent. She cannot answer him, but she does not pull away. Mark touches her hand, and in that moment their worlds are turned upside down. They both understand that there is no turning back. The next day, Sarah feels exhausted. She is haunted by the thought that she is betraying John, but her passion for Mark overshadows her guilt. She tries to return to her normal life, but every phone call from Mark, every visit to the house ruins her attempts. They begin to find more and more reasons to meet, shopping, traveling together, helping with household chores. All this becomes a cover for their secret dates, secret meetings. Sarah and Mark begin dating outside the home. Mark invites Sarah to go to a nearby town under the pretext of helping with business matters. She agrees, justifying it to John as a necessary trip for family matters. Mark rents a hotel room, and there the thing they have been waiting for so long happens. Their first night together turns into a storm of emotions. They seem to splash out all their suppressed feelings, and Sarah feels at the peak of happiness, despite the realization that she has betrayed her husband. This first meeting at the hotel becomes the beginning of a chain of events that will begin to destroy their lives. Now, they are looking for an opportunity to meet as often as possible. Mark finds excuses to take Sarah away from the city, where no one knows them. At first, these are just dinners in restaurants, then walks in parks, and finally, constant meetings in secluded places. Sarah feels like she's living a double life. When she's at home, she tries to play the role of a model wife and mother, but her thoughts are always somewhere far away with Mark. Every time John hugs her or talks about his plans for the future, she feels pain inside. Her love for her husband is slowly fading, and her passion for Mark is growing stronger. Growing suspicions. However, John Brooks is not as naive as he seems. He begins to notice changes in Sarah's behavior. She has become more absent-minded, her eyes often wandering into the distance when he talks to her. John notices that Sarah spends too much time outside the house, under the pretext of meeting friends or going shopping. But most importantly, he begins to feel a chill in her relationship with him. She no longer smiles when he comes home and hugs him less and less often before bed. One evening, John decides to talk to Sarah. He notices that something has changed in their marriage, but he can't figure out what it is. His intuition tells him that it might be someone else, but he's afraid to admit it. "Sarah, I feel like you've become different lately. You're home less and less, and I don't feel the same closeness between us. What's going on?" John asks anxiously. Sarah, taken aback, doesn't know what to say. Her heart is pounding, and she knows John is starting to suspect something, but she decides to reassure him by hiding the truth. "John, I've just been busy lately. The kids, the house, I'm getting tired. Maybe I just need some time to myself." John is unsure of her words, but decides to back off, not wanting to ruin the peace in the family. He convinces himself that these are temporary difficulties, and everything will return to normal. But Sarah knows that this is only the beginning of the end, deepening the emotional connection. While John struggles to maintain his trust in his wife, Sarah and Mark continue to deepen their emotional connection. Their secret meetings become more frequent, and each time they feel more connected to each other. Mark begins to say that he can no longer live without Sarah, that he wants her to leave John for him. "Sarah, you know this isn't just a fling. You feel the same way I do. We're meant to be together," he tells her one day during a meeting. Sarah feels this pressure. Her life becomes a constant conflict between duty and passion. She understands that Mark is right. Their connection is too strong to ignore. But at the same time, she is not ready to destroy her family, leaving her husband and children for a man with whom she is connected only by passion. With each passing day, her inner tension grows, and she realizes that her secret is about to come out, threatening everything she has built over the years. The secret affair between Sarah and Mark is gaining momentum, and they can no longer control their emotions. Their relationship is becoming more passionate but also dangerous. Sarah tries to lead a double life, hiding everything from John, but her anxiety is growing. She understands that this cannot continue forever. Mark, on the contrary, begins to lose his sense of proportion, becoming obsessed with their relationship and demanding more from Sarah. Mark, who at first seemed level-headed and considerate, now begins to show signs of jealousy and control. He is no longer satisfied with rare meetings in secluded places and begins to pressure Sarah to make the decision to leave her husband. Mark begins to wonder why she is putting it off for so long. His obsession only intensifies with each passing day. Signs of danger. Sarah feels like she is losing control of the situation. Mark demands that she stop pretending to John and finally confess everything to him. This scares Sarah. She is not ready for such decisive action, as she is afraid of destroying her family. Despite her feelings for Mark, she is still attached to her husband and children. She is afraid to imagine what will happen if John finds out about the affair. Mark, in turn, is not going to wait any longer. "How many games do you have to play, Sarah?" Mark says one day when they meet in a secret place. "You say you love me, but you continue to live with him. It's ridiculous." Sarah tries to calm him down, explaining that she needs time, that she is not ready for such a drastic step. But Mark becomes increasingly impatient and even aggressive. "If you don't make up your mind, Sarah, I'll tell John everything myself. He needs to know the truth," Mark threatens. These words horrify Sarah. She realizes that Mark is no longer the calm and balanced person he seemed at the beginning of their affair. Now he is becoming a threat not only to her marriage, but to her very life. John's suspicions. Meanwhile, John begins to notice more and more strange behavior in Sarah. He cannot ignore the obvious signs that something is wrong. Sarah has become nervous, often leaves the house under various pretexts, and no longer shows the same care for him as before. John also begins to notice that Mark comes to their house too often, and that his attention to Sarah goes beyond friendship. One day, returning home early from work, John finds Sarah talking to Mark on the phone. What seemed like a casual conversation turns out to be much more personal than it should be. Sarah quickly ends the call when she spots John, but his suspicions are already growing. "Why does Mark call you so often? What do you even talk about?" John asks suspiciously. Sarah tries to calm her husband down, assuring him that it was just a business conversation. But John is not so easily reassured. He begins to piece together all the little details: Sarah's frequent absences, her strange behavior, and Mark's constant presence in their lives. The turning point. One evening, John decides not to go straight home from work, but to stay and watch the house. He notices Mark's car pull up to the house. At first, he thinks that Mark has just come to visit them, as he did before. But this time, he stays longer than usual. John waits outside and sees Mark come out an hour later, not through the front door, but through the back. This scene finally convinces John that something is wrong between his wife and his best friend. Suspicions of an affair begin to flicker in his head, but he is still not ready to fully believe it. He decides not to make a scandal, but to start acting more covertly in order to gather evidence. Psychological pressure on Sarah. Sarah feels like her life is falling apart. Mark is becoming more and more insistent, demanding that she leave her husband. At the same time, John is increasingly asking her questions and closely watching her every move. Her inner world is torn apart, and she does not know who to trust or what to do next. On one of their dates, Mark once again confronts Sarah with a choice. He is no longer willing to tolerate uncertainty and demands that she make a decision right now. "If you don't leave John, I'll leave your life forever. But know that if that happens, I'll tell him everything. Let him know who you really are," Mark declares with cold determination. Sarah is in a panic. She realizes that any move she makes will lead to disaster. If she leaves John, she will lose her family and perhaps the respect of others. If she stays with him, she will lose Mark and face the threat of exposure. At this point, she realizes that her life is on the line, and any wrong decision could lead to irreparable consequences. The relationship between Sarah and Mark continues to escalate rapidly. What began as a passionate affair now turns into a dangerous game where the stakes are too high. Mark begins to show more signs of jealousy and control, and Sarah finds herself trapped in her own emotions. At this point, their relationship reaches a breaking point. Arguments and threats become an integral part of their interactions. Growing tension. Mark calls Sarah more and more often and demands that she meet him. His messages become more insistent. He no longer hides his obsession, and every time she postpones a meeting or does not answer his calls, he falls into fits of jealousy. His control begins to put pressure on Sarah, and she feels that she is losing freedom in her actions. "You don't pick up when I call again. Do you know what that looks like?" Mark says with irritation the next time they meet in a parking lot to avoid suspicion. "You're playing with me, Sarah. You promised that we would be together, and you continue to hide behind your husband's back." Sarah feels cornered. She no longer experiences the same euphoria from their meetings that she used to. Mark begins to threaten to expose her if she does not decide to leave John. There is a threat in his voice, and Sarah understands that he is no longer just a lover, but a threat to her peace and safety. The first serious quarrel. One evening, when Mark invites Sarah to meet him at a local motel, she declines, citing family matters. This leads to the first serious quarrel between them. Mark, full of jealousy, does not believe her and begins to accuse her of using him. "You're using me, Sarah. You're just afraid to admit it. You love the comfortable life with John, but you want to keep me as a backup," Mark screams into the phone. Sarah tries to remain calm, but she senses that Mark is losing control. Their conversation escalates into shouting, and Mark hangs up. At this point, Sarah realizes that their relationship has taken a dangerous turn. She fears not only for her reputation, but also for her safety. Mark is becoming increasingly unpredictable, and his threats to expose their affair are becoming more frequent. Pressure from Mark. Mark doesn't stop at verbal threats. He becomes more aggressive, stalking Sarah outside her home and threatening to meet John unless she agrees to stop refusing and continue the relationship. He no longer hides his jealousy and rage. "I'm going to talk to John, Sarah. Let him know who you really are. I'm not going to be second best. You have to choose me, and you know it," he says, looking her straight in the eye when he intercepts her in the parking lot after the store one day. Sarah is deeply afraid. She realizes that Mark is no longer acting within reason. He is ready to destroy not only her family, but her life. Every time they meet, the tension mounts, and Sarah begins to feel like a hostage to her own decisions. John's suspicions grow. Meanwhile, John continues to notice strange changes in his wife's behavior. He sees her becoming increasingly nervous, avoiding direct conversations, and spending a lot of time away from home. John's suspicions, which have been growing for months, now become more justified. He decides to take action. One evening, when Sarah says she's going to see a friend, John decides to follow her. He takes a car and follows Sarah at a distance as she heads to a cafe where she has an appointment with Mark. At this point, John is almost certain that something is wrong, but he's still not ready to believe that his wife could be cheating on him with his best friend. When Sarah enters the cafe, John stays in the car and watches as Mark approaches her. They sit down at a table and their conversation seems too intimate for a normal friendship. John sees Mark take Sarah's hand, and at that moment his world begins to crumble. Open threats. Mark, realizing that he is losing control of the situation, decides to act radically. One day, when John is away, Mark suddenly shows up at Sarah's house without warning. He is no longer in control of his emotions. His obsession with Sarah reaches its peak. At this point, he not only demands that she leave her husband but also threatens that, if she does not do so, he will tell John about everything. Do you think you can live a double life forever? No, Sarah, I won't allow it. Either you leave for me, or I'll tell your husband everything and you'll lose everything. Your family and your reputation, Mark says menacingly, standing in the doorway of the house. Sarah, horrified by his threats, tries to calm him down, but Mark has already gone too far. His face is filled with anger and despair. The fire of obsession burns in his eyes, and Sarah understands that he is ready to do anything to get her. Sarah's internal rift. Sarah is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Her life is no longer her own. On the one hand, she is afraid of being exposed. On the other, she realizes that she can no longer continue her affair with Mark. She understands that Mark is becoming increasingly dangerous and his threats could lead to disaster. Every night when she goes to bed next to John, she is tormented by guilt. She cannot hide the truth for long, but she also cannot tell her husband everything. She finds herself in a dead end where any decision seems destructive. Mark now controls not only her actions but also her thoughts, leaving her with no way out. The romance between Sarah and Mark descends into uncontrollable chaos. The passion that once seemed exciting now becomes a source of fear and threats. Sarah finds herself in a position where any action she takes could lead to disaster. Mark no longer hides his obsession and is ready to ruin her life if she does not leave John. John, suspecting something is wrong, begins to take his own steps to find out the truth. Sarah's emotional isolation. Sarah feels like her world is falling apart. She can no longer lead a normal family life with John. Their relationship is gradually turning into an empty shell, devoid of emotion and intimacy. Sarah tries to maintain the appearance of a normal life for her children, but it is very difficult for her. She can no longer smile. She can no longer be a caring mother. Every step she takes is burdened with the fear of exposure. Every time John hugs her or talks about his plans for the future, Sarah feels like a traitor. She realizes that she is destroying her family for the sake of a relationship that she thought would bring happiness, but is now leading to her death. She is afraid of what Mark might do and no longer knows who to trust. John's paranoia and suspicions. John's suspicions continue to grow. He notices every little detail in Sarah's behavior, her constant nervousness, her late return, her distant looks. After he saw her with Mark in the cafe, his inner doubts only strengthened. Now John no longer doubts that something serious is happening. He decides to act more actively. John starts checking Sarah's phone, her messages and calls. He looks for any evidence of her infidelity, but Sarah becomes more cautious. She deletes all messages with Mark and tries not to leave a trace. However, the tension in their relationship becomes more and more obvious, and John decides to go further. He hires a private detective to follow his wife and her movements. "You've changed, Sarah. You're not the same person I knew," John says one evening as they sit down to dinner. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to find out. I won't live in ignorance." Sarah feels increasingly threatened by John and panic sets in. She knows he's close to the truth, but she's not ready to confess yet. Any move she makes could give her away, and now she's forced to constantly look over her shoulder. Escalation of conflict with Mark. Mark, realizing that his pressure on Sarah is not bringing the desired result, begins to act more radically. His jealousy and obsession grow stronger every day. He no longer hides his aggression and exactingness. Mark constantly accuses Sarah of delaying the moment of separation from John. "You can't live this lie forever, Sarah. Why are you still with him? You promised we'd be together," Mark yells during another meeting. Sarah tries to calm him down, but her words no longer have the same impact as before. Mark sees that she is afraid that her marriage is falling apart, but she cannot make a final decision. A plan is born in his head. If Sarah does not leave John herself, then he will do it for her. Threat of exposure. Mark decides to move on to open blackmail. One day, after a tense conversation, he calls Sarah and gives her an ultimatum. "If you don't tell John the whole truth in the next 2 days, then I will. I will meet him in person and tell him everything. You chose this path yourself, and I am not going to wait any longer." These words frighten Sarah to the depths of her soul. She understands that she has no more time. Now every step she takes has consequences. If Mark carries out his threat, her life will be destroyed, and she will lose everything that is dear to her: her husband, her children, her reputation. Her heart is squeezed with fear, and she understands that Mark has already become her enemy. Voltage peak. These threats turn Sarah's life into a living nightmare. She can no longer sleep peacefully and is tormented by constant nightmares of Mark telling John the truth. Every call or text from Mark sends her into a panic. She knows she can't continue in this manner, but she sees no way out. Soon, Sarah makes an attempt to end her relationship with Mark. She meets him in the park and tells him that she can no longer continue the affair, that she is not ready to destroy her family for the sake of their relationship. "Mark, I can't live like this anymore. It's gone too far. We need to stop this before it gets any worse," she says, trying to keep her composure. But Mark, instead of accepting her words, becomes even more aggressive. "You think you can just walk away? No, Sarah, this won't end until I say it does. You'll be mine, or I'll ruin your life," he threatens. These words send Sarah into a state of complete horror. She understands that Mark will not stop anymore. He is ready to do everything to get her, even if it means destroying her family. From this moment on, her life turns into a constant expectation of disaster. The climax between Sarah and Mark is brewing. Their relationship, which once seemed exciting and filled with passion, has now turned into a series of threatening and dangerous situations. Mark becomes more aggressive with each passing day, his obsession with Sarah taking over more aspects of her life. John, her husband, continues to investigate his wife's strange behavior and prepares to reveal the whole truth. Tensions mount, and the final catastrophe becomes inevitable. Sarah's growing fears. Sarah feels trapped. After her last conversation with Mark, when he openly threatened to expose their affair, she realizes that she no longer has control over her life. Her every move is under close surveillance, and she can trust no one, neither Mark nor John. Now her fears are only growing, and she can no longer think about the future of her family without a terrible premonition. Sarah is trying to find a solution. She is looking for ways to end her relationship with Mark, but she is afraid that his threats will be carried out. She considers telling John everything first, hoping for his forgiveness, but she is terrified of how he will react. What if John cannot forgive her? What if he just leaves, leaving her alone with her life in ruins? Every time she goes to bed, Sarah can't stop having nightmares about Mark telling John everything and her life falling apart before her eyes. Her fears turn into paranoia, and she begins to think that she is being followed. Sarah no longer feels safe even in her own home. Emotional pressure from Mark. Mark, feeling that he is losing control over Sarah, becomes increasingly aggressive. He no longer plays the role of an attentive lover. His obsession develops into a real mania. Every time they meet, he gives her an ultimatum. Either she leaves John and goes to him, or he will tell her husband everything. "Do you think you can hide our affair forever? Do you think I'll keep quiet while you hide behind your husband's back? No, Sarah. This is all going to end soon. And if you don't make a choice yourself, I will make it for you, Mark says furiously when they meet in a car on the outskirts of town. Sarah tries to persuade him to wait, to give her time to sort herself out, but Mark is no longer prepared to endure. He begins to stalk her, appearing in unexpected places when she least expects it. Sarah feels that she is losing control of her life. She cannot relax for a minute because Mark constantly pressures and threatens her. One evening, while John is out running errands, Mark shows up unexpectedly at their house. He rings the doorbell and demands to see her. Sarah panics. She can't let Mark in the house with the kids inside, but she can't just ignore him. She has to go outside and meet him in the driveway. You can't hide anymore, Sarah. You have to tell him, Mark says with cold determination, standing right in front of her. Sarah is shaking with fear. She begs him to leave and give her some more time, but Mark is no longer listening to her. His face is distorted with anger, and Sarah realizes that he is ready to do anything to get his way. She understands that at this point Mark is already a real danger to her family and to herself. John's deepening suspicion. John, still suspicious of his wife, is getting closer to discovering the truth. After hiring a private detective, he gets more and more evidence that Sarah is leading a double life. The detective gives him photos of Sarah meeting Mark in cafes and other places. This drives John crazy, but he still tries to convince himself that it could be a simple misunderstanding. However, an inner voice tells him that everything is much worse. John decides to act decisively. He arranges a surprise interrogation for Sarah to force her to confess. You're dating Mark, right? I saw you together. You can't deny it anymore. Tell me the truth, Sarah, John says angrily when they are alone after dinner. Sarah is shocked. She realizes that John already knows about the affair, but she is not ready to tell him everything yet. She panics and begins to defend herself, denying everything, hoping that she can convince her husband of her innocence. John, it's not what you think. Mark and I are just friends. You misunderstood me, Sarah replies, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. But John no longer believes her words. He demands an explanation, but Sarah refuses to tell the truth. Now the tension between them reaches its limit, and John decides to act in his own way to find out the whole truth to the end. Mark's plan. Mark, realizing that Sarah continues to put off her decision, decides to take matters into his own hands. He is no longer willing to wait for her to tell John everything herself. Mark is ready to go to extreme measures to destroy her marriage and get her. He comes up with a plan. Mark decides to meet John face to face and tell him about his affair with Sarah. He is sure that John will not be able to stand it and will leave Sarah, leaving her for him. In his head, this scenario seems like the only way out of the situation. I'll meet him and tell him everything. If you don't tell him the truth yourself, I'll do it for you, Mark tells Sarah during their last conversation. Sarah is in a panic. She knows that if Mark carries out his threat, her life will be ruined. She begs him not to do it, but Mark has already made up his mind. He no longer listens to her excuses and demands. In his eyes, there is only one thing: he wants her and is ready to destroy everything to get her. Climax. Sarah feels like time is running out. Her life is becoming unbearable. Mark is constantly stalking her. John is demanding the truth, and she can't find a way out of this nightmare. She is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She has nowhere else to run, and any step she takes will lead to disaster. Now she understands that Mark has already crossed all boundaries, and his next step will be decisive. John continues to monitor her behavior, and she knows that the truth will soon come out. Tragedy seems inevitable, and Sarah realizes that her world will never be the same again. The situation around Sarah, Mark, and John is approaching an inevitable conclusion. Their lives are intertwined in a toxic triangle from which there is no escape. Mark's obsession reaches its limit. John is ready to find out the whole truth, and Sarah is in a state of complete despair. Now not only her future is at stake, but also her life. Mark's solution. Mark is not going to wait any longer. His patience is exhausted and he decides to put his plan into action. He wants to meet John and tell him everything. In Mark's mind, this is the only way to free Sarah from her marriage and make her be with him. He can no longer tolerate her excuses and secrecy. One evening, Mark calls Sarah and tells her that he is going to come to their house to meet John in person. Sarah panics. She begs Mark not to do it, but his decision is unwavering. "I won't hide anymore, Sarah. Either you tell John the whole truth now, or I will do it myself. You must choose me or lose everything," Mark says furiously on the phone. Sarah is horrified. She realizes that she can no longer hide the truth and that Mark is serious about ruining her life. Only one thought comes to mind. She must stop Mark at any cost before he meets John. John learns the truth. John, who has long suspected something is wrong, receives new evidence from the detective that confirms his worst fears. Photos and recordings of Sarah's meetings with Mark leave no doubt. His wife is cheating on him with his best friend. John feels his life is falling apart. He is devastated by the betrayal, that his closest friend and the person he loved cheated on him behind his back. That evening, John decides to talk to Sarah. He can no longer live in uncertainty and prepares to ask her the most difficult questions. He feels that now is the moment of truth. When Sarah returns home, she feels that John has changed. He looks tense and cold. She realizes that he knows something. "You have to tell me everything, Sarah. I've seen it all. I know you're dating Mark. Now I want the truth," John says, his voice full of anger and pain. Sarah is shaking. She feels the world crumbling around her. This is the moment she has been dreading. She stands before John and realizes she can no longer lie. Now she must choose between her marriage and Mark. "John, I didn't mean to do this. It all got out of control," she begins to say, breaking into tears. John listens to her, but his gaze is cold and distant. He doesn't need any more excuses. He only wants to know one thing: how long this has been going on and what she's going to do next. Meeting with Mark. At this point, Mark is already on his way home. He is sure that meeting John will put an end to all his suffering. Mark is in a state of emotional instability. He understands that he is ruining someone's life, but nothing stops him anymore. For him, this is the last step to getting Sarah. As Mark pulls up to the house, John and Sarah continue their tense conversation. Inside the house, the atmosphere is oppressive. Sarah is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. John is on the verge of rage. Mark gets out of the car and walks confidently to the door. He is no longer hiding. He is ready for the final confrontation. He rings the doorbell, and the sound seems to echo throughout the house. John, hearing the bell, heads for the door. Sarah screams, trying to stop him. "No, John, don't open the door," she screams, realizing that meeting Mark could lead to unpredictable consequences. But John is already too angry and determined to find out the truth. He opens the door and sees Mark standing in front of him. At that moment, everything becomes clear. John knows that Mark has come to tell him everything. Tense confrontation. The meeting between the two men begins tensely. They both stand in front of each other, assessing the situation. Mark understands that John is ready for a showdown, but he is no longer afraid. He came here with one goal: to expose Sarah and get what he wants. "You still don't know the truth, John," Mark says coldly, stepping forward. "I loved her all this time. We were together behind your back." John is momentarily speechless. Mark's words have shattered his world. The anger he has been holding back for months flares up inside him. He cannot believe that the man he considered a friend has betrayed him in this way. "You slept with my wife?" John says, his face turning red with rage, breaking into a scream. Mark, without feeling an ounce of remorse, replies, "Yes, and now she should be with me. She doesn't need you." These words cut to the core of John's soul. His anger turns into physical action. In a fit of rage, he lunges at Mark and a fight ensues. Both men are consumed with aggression. They push, punch, oblivious to everything around them. Sarah screams, begging them to stop, but no one listens. Deadly ending. At one point, John pushes Mark so hard that he falls and hits his head on the edge of a table in the hallway. Mark loses consciousness for a moment and blood begins to stream down his forehead. John, furious, swings at him again, but Sarah manages to intervene. "John, stop, please, you're going to kill him," she screams, grabbing her husband's hand. John, stunned by what has just happened, takes a step back, trying to comprehend what he has just done. Mark lies on the floor, his body weakening, and he loses consciousness. An oppressive silence falls over the house, broken only by Sarah's sobs. John, realizing that tragedy has occurred, kneels down next to Mark, realizing that his life is ruined. Mark dies right before his eyes, and John, in a state of shock, realizes that his future is now completely changed. After a fateful encounter between John and Mark, Sarah and John's lives changed dramatically. What began as a secret romance turned into a bloody drama with a tragic outcome. Now Sarah and John find themselves in the midst of shattered hopes, deadly mistakes, and inevitable consequences, shock and devastation. The house where the tragedy took place is now shrouded in heavy silence. John, still in shock, sits on the floor next to Mark's body, not understanding how it all happened. Fragments of the argument, the moment of impact, and the realization that he may have killed his friend flash through his mind. His life, built on stability and success, has literally been turned into ruins overnight. Sarah cries against the wall. She no longer knows how to react to what has happened. Her entire existence is now dominated by one terrible fact. Her infidelity led to the death of a man. She blames herself for letting the affair go so far, for not stopping Mark and not telling John the truth sooner. Her mind races with thoughts of how different the outcome could have been if she had made different decisions. "Call an ambulance." Realizing that Mark is no longer breathing, John decides to call the police. His hands are shaking as he dials the number. He realizes that everything will change now. The police, the investigation, the trial. They will both be under close scrutiny. John understands that they have a long road ahead of them through the legal processes and that their lives will never be the same. When the police and ambulance arrive, Sarah and John tell their version of events. John, without hiding the truth, tells what happened. At this time, the medics confirm that Mark died on the spot from the blow. The police begin an investigation, examining the scene, taking pictures and taking statements from John and Sarah. Beginning of the investigation, the police are treating the incident as manslaughter caused by an argument that turned violent. However, John knows that this was no accident. His actions were motivated by anger, jealousy, and the pain of betrayal. Even though the situation looks like self-defense, the legal consequences could be serious. He could be charged with manslaughter. Sarah, giving evidence, cannot hold back her tears. Her feelings are mixed. Not only has she lost Mark, with whom she had a difficult but passionate relationship, but now she risks losing John, whom she still loves despite what happened. Sarah realizes that it was her actions that led to this tragedy, and she will have to live with it for the rest of her life. Media and public opinion. Since Mark was a well-known figure in their town, his death quickly becomes public news. Local newspapers and television reports begin discussing the tragedy, and public opinion is divided. Some believe that John was simply defending himself and his family, while others blame him for failing to handle the situation peacefully. News headlines include "Family drama ends in death" and "Lawyer's tragic death. Who's to blame?" Sarah and John become the center of attention, which only worsens their personal drama. Now they can't hide from prying eyes, and their life turns into a series of interrogations, visits from journalists, and public condemnation. Sarah avoids going outside, afraid to face the wrath or condemnation of her neighbors. Litigation. The legal process begins. John is charged with manslaughter, and his lawyer argues that John acted in a state of passion, protecting his family and home. The trial turns into a harrowing ordeal for John and Sarah, who are forced to relive every detail of that night over and over again. During the trial, John openly admits his guilt over what happened. He says his actions were driven by anger and pain, that he did not want to kill Mark, but he could not control himself. Sarah testifies, explaining that she tried to stop Mark and keep John from becoming violent, but the situation got out of control. The defense attorney argues that John did not intend to kill Mark and that it was a tragic accident. A psychological examination confirms that John acted in a state of severe emotional distress, which may mitigate the sentence. Verdict and consequences. After a long trial, the court reaches its verdict. John is found guilty of manslaughter, but receives a reduced sentence due to his defense and his guilty plea. He is given a suspended sentence and community service. However, John realizes that even with a suspended sentence, his life will never be the same. It's not the end for Sarah either. Her inner turmoil haunts her. She must live with the knowledge that her betrayal caused someone's death and that she destroyed the family she loved. Even though she and John remain together, their relationship is forever changed. New reality. After the trial, Sarah and John try to rebuild their lives. They still live in the same house, but every corner of the house reminds them of the tragedy. John still loves Sarah, but he is having a hard time coping with the betrayal she committed. He tries to forgive her, but Mark's shadow still hangs over their relationship. Sarah, despite staying with John, feels devastated. She knows she will never be able to fully regain her husband's trust, and the guilt over what happened will haunt her for the rest of her life. She often finds herself thinking that life could have turned out differently if she had made different choices.